Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the tiebreak day of the semi-finals Grand Prix Jerusalem, that is. To remind you, we already have one finalist. It's Jan Nepomniachtchi himself, who has won his match against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the classical time format. So he is continuing his campaign to qualify for the candidates. It's not all lost for Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. He will be waiting for the final to finish. In case Jan Nepomniachtchi fails to win the final, fails to win the event, Maxime will be through himself to the candidates tournament. So now we'll have a tiebreak to figure out who's going to be the opponent for Jan Nepomniachtchi. It will be a rapid playoff between Wei and David Navarra. So to start that, it'll be a mini match of 2 games, 25 minutes plus 10 seconds. So pretty usual, pretty standard tiebreak system. In case of a 1-1, in case of a tie, and typically we are speaking of 2 draws, but sometimes like one player would win game 1 but lose in game 2. We've seen it already. That's what happened to Wei in his tiebreak against Karyakin, for example. So in case of a tie, we'll progress further on to have a shorter rapid, 10 minutes plus 10 seconds, and a blitz afterwards, and the Armageddon afterwards if needed. And David Navarra has already played his move 1, knight g1 to f3. I believe we didn't see this one just yet. Yesterday they've played the Grunfeld. I don't quite remember the moves order, but I believe it was fair square d4, c4. Right, well, really interesting classical game was played yesterday between those 2 players. Well, maybe not the, not the endgame part, not those 15, 20 moves that perhaps were unnecessary. But, well, in terms of the opening, it was a very interesting discussion. So I really don't mind if they will repeat the same line. So, greetings to guys in YouTube chat in the World Chess channel. Yeah, I can see some people watching us from the United States of America. So good morning. Must be very early for you guys. Yeah, and way out of the book, a funny comment by our friend Lavrinda as well. No, I don't think so. He's not out of the book. He's trying to consider what the transpositions he's up to. Right, so much shorter time control, but only 1 game. So hopefully still we'll be able to cover all the details in the opening and then the end game if needed. Before we switch to the analysis board view once again, let me once again thank those who supported the event and the entire Grand Prix series. Once again, for Sagro, strategic partner of the Grand Prix series, Algorand, the blockchain partner, Kaspersky, cybersecurity partner, and Ustek, the partner of the event in Jerusalem. Thank those companies for supporting chess. Right, and the position on the board kind of shapes up. So let's get our analysis board rolling. I'll try to explain something here. Right, so knight f3, knight f6, c4. That used to be my moves order. I would say I was playing closed openings very often, and closed opening it's basically anything but e4, right? So you start with d4, it's closed opening, c4, it's closed opening. So that would be my moves order as well when I know kind of 100% that my opponent plays the Grunfeld, because it allows for a lot of various lines against the Grunfeld. After d5, for instance, c takes, knight takes, you have really a lot of anti-Grunfeld options, like h4 here, queen a4 here, queen a4 on a previous move. But yeah, with this game going so quickly, I'm afraid I'll have to speed up just not to miss what's going on. Queen to b3, yeah, that's yet another legit move. Black doesn't really want to capture on c3 right here, so it's not exactly the Grunfeld. After knight takes c3, one of the funny options white has is actually to capture on c3 with the queen, and black can't play his usual bishop g7 castle short. He will have to play an awkward move f6 here, or rook g8 losing the castle right. In both cases, black is not very happy. So in a way, queen b3 already avoids the Grunfeld, and, well, Grunfeld setups, so to speak. Black's typical reply is knight to b6. Wait a second. Yeah, knight to b6, d4, bishop to g7, e4. White gets the center as very, very typical for the Grunfeld defense. A bishop g4, and now I believe we have switched to very well-known line with a subtle difference. Typically, the bishop is. Wait a second. How it's played? Bishop b5 check, c6, bishop to e2. I know. White actually started with knight g5. Yeah, threatening on f7, castle short, bishop e2, bishop takes, knight takes. I'm pretty sure that that position was played for a few times. Capturing with the knight on e4, so white later on has queen to h3. The subtle difference being the pawn on c6, perhaps, because guess what? In this position, white could go knight g5 at once, castle short, bishop e2, trade here, so that black pawn would be on c7, which would allow for an extra option, knight to c6. Right? So bishop b5 check. Provokes the pawn to c6. After knight g5, you probably don't want to take on b5. At the very least, white has queen f7 check, queen takes g7. Might have, yeah, I mean, that's good enough of a reason not to even try to take on b5. Right, so what happens after knight e2, queen h3 is a serious threat. Black goes for c5, d takes c5, knight 6 to d7, white captures on b7, check from a5, bishop d2, queen a6. Say if you capture on a8, I suspect you'll not enjoy it after knight c6. The queen is getting trapped, so white has to trade on f8. I'm not sure what black captures on f8 with. Could be with the knight, so that the bishop remains here on g7, targeting b2. And the problem for white, so technically white is up material, right? Two rooks for the queen plus 2 pawns. Even if he loses a couple of pawns there, he's still, like, 2 rooks are typically stronger than a queen. The problem, however, is white can't castle in this line, right? If you castle, you drop the knight on e2. And with king in the center, it's a very, very dangerous business. Therefore, c6, but once again, if you've paid attention to the camera view, all those moves were played very, very quickly. So basically, that's a preparation from David Navarra. c6 played, queen captures on c6. And the way he paused here before taking on c6, but it has to be said, well, he doesn't have all that much of a choice in this position. Perhaps knight to c5 could have been the move. Could have been the move to consider. So that same queen a8 runs into knight takes c6. Queen is trapped precisely the same way. And if you trade on a6, maybe it's kind of awkward for black, because now you don't want to capture on a6 with the c5 knight, right? The knight on c5 is already an active piece. But if you take with this knight, that means c6 pawn is not attacked for now. So maybe that was... So basically it was a choice between knight to c5 or queen c6, the move we ended up playing. Trade on c6 happened, and rook to c1. So white is up a pawn. Black has some compensation, that's I'm sure. The powerful bishop on g7, white's slight lack in development normally has to be good enough for equality for black, but he's the one who has to play the very, very precise moves. After rook c8, b2, b3, yeah, keeping the pawn alive. Now black has to prove that he has enough compensation, because for white, a couple of moves needed to establish control. Like you probably castle on, even though it's a castle short, obviously. castle long is not possible. Even though it's an endgame, and very often in the end game you want to keep the king close to the center, but this would require some additional actions, right? Like king on d2 won't be safe even if you get it there. King on e2, first of all, you'll have to move the knight from e2, and then when you go king e2, it's knight d4. So all in all, you want your king in the center, but you can't manage, right? So you castle short, you probably play bishop e3, and by that moment you've already like capitalizing on your extra pawn. Knight d7 to e5, yeah, logical. Knight goes to d3. Well, and I can see chat discussing that this game, well, this position has happened in one of the previous games. Rook a to c8, MVL lost to... Guys, can you please specify what game we are talking about? So it did happen, right? It did happen. So instead of knight d7 to e5, if I understand the chat correctly, there was a game of Maxime Vichelographe who played bishop b2, which kind of makes sense, right? Point being that after rook c2, which is a natural move, I suspect black would have knight to e5 or even knight b4 is possible. So that if white captures, black has knight d3 intermediate, then takes back on c8. But knight d7 to e5 seems very, very logical. Even though, well, let's see what happened. Knight to e5, castles was played, yeah. And knight went to d3. So it's still a little bit awkward for white. But an extra pawn, of course, counts for something. So what black is planning to do, I suspect, is to play the other knight to e5. Well, actually, knight d4 is a legit idea as well. So say, in case of rook c2, you might as well go knight d4. Well, white similarly has to take on d4 first. After bishop d4, the c2 rook has no better future than to trade on c8, rook c8, and then rook c2 is coming. I'm guessing in this case, black has to have enough compensation. Like knight f3, you probably switch the diagonal by that point and keep the bishop on b6, targeting f2, and then rook c2 is coming. Knight d to e5 is supposed to be an inaccuracy. Oh, well, interesting. Pawn is the pawn. Yeah, the pawn is the pawn, but first white has to reestablish the coordination yet, because the knight on g5 is not doing much. And what they do, in fact, what they do after knight d3, maybe you play rook d1, but then, you know, apart from various like knight e5s and stuff, what happens if black actually goes knight b2? You probably go back and knight d3. It's kind of, yes, you've played rook b1, you've won a tempo, move again. Because, yeah, now black also has like either rook to d8, knight e5, or knight d4, the same thing. I'm not sure if white has much in this version. We'll see. So rook f to d8 supposedly was the more precise way to handle the position over here, as pointed out by one of our chat users. But yeah, but knight d5 seems to be absolutely reasonable. Castles, knight d3, yeah, well, let's see. For the time being, yeah, the rook is still on c1. Well, answering the question about qualification to the candidates, I mean, which was basically pops up starting from day one of this tournament. For the time being, it's very, very simple. If Nepomniachtchi wins the final, it's Nepo who qualifies. If he loses the final, it's MVL who qualifies, along with Krysiak, who is already there. Basically, that's it. So Navarra and Wei, they cannot, I mean, they can win the tournament, but each of them can win the tournament. None of them can qualify. Today we will know the name of a second finalist, one of them being Nepo already. And yeah, we will know the name of Nepo's opponent, whom Jan needs to beat in order to qualify himself to the candidates tournament. Checking if there were any other valid points made in the chat. Well, speaking of that game, yeah, I've missed the moment where people mentioned who was the opponent. Yeah, also it was Yakovenko Maxim Vishalograph, it seems. The game that you guys were talking about, where Bishop B2 was played by MVL, right? Instead of knight D5. So rook c to d1 played after knight d3, and I don't think knight b2 is the good move, or even like a considerable move. But even so, I mean, even if black goes knight b2 and back, I don't see an easy way for white to prove that he actually has an advantage. But there should be better moves. There should be better moves. Well, rook fd8 obviously is one of the moves to consider. Let's see. Knight b2 is actually played, and played reasonably quickly, so it might be a good move after all. So the question is, what happens after rook b1, right? Because after any other moves with the rook, like c1, e1, or a1, black is reasonably happy returning the knight back. So the critical test is, of course, when white plays rook to b1, and then you might consider going rook d8 here, trying to win a tempo, right? Because white doesn't have rook d1 in this position. But then I'm somewhat unhappy about bishop c3. I'm somewhat unhappy about bishop c3. So perhaps just knight d3 back. White may not have much, but Navarra has reduced it to 2 results game. Perhaps, yeah. Well, I can hardly imagine white losing if he'd be, say, on time to switch to, I'm no longer playing for win. I want to, simplify and return my pawn and make a draw. Rook fd8, by the way, being played. So I'm wondering what will be the response to bishop c3. I mean, what you can do, you can capture here and then return to d3, planning for, once again, for knight e5 or knight d4 or knight b4 even, where the knight on c3 will be hanging, and then maybe you'll grab the a2 pawn. But it's kind of tricky a little bit. So my point of returning back to d3 was that black has rook d8 is an idea, as well knight e5, knight d4, but mainly after bishop c3 and bishops getting swapped, black would not play rook fd8, but instead would go for an immediate knight to b4, where the knight on c3 is hanging, as well as the a2 pawn. So in this particular line, it would have been better to return the knight on d3 first and not play rook f2 d8. Let's see, but once again, yeah, rook fd8 is perfectly a reasonable move. Interesting. So basically, what David Navarra does when going for this opening line is kind of checking if if his opponent did his homework, yeah, because it doesn't seem to be. I mean, sometimes when the novelty is brought very early in the game, like if you think of the classical game Nepomniachtchi won against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. We had a very, very fresh position as early as move 7 and move 8, right? And then, yeah, I mean, even like if you decide who prepared the novelty, probably you were unable to analyze all the consequences at home. So you just familiarize yourself with the position and you play it over the board. But here, it narrows down. I mean, the theoretical line went 18 moves deep or something. So it narrows down to a very specific kind of position where if your opponent knows like few good moves, it might just peter out to a draw immediately. Yeah, and still the discussion on the wild card, on the wild card of the candidates. Yeah, it's already been announced. It's since it will be held in Russia, it will be Russian players. Basically, it's for now the realistic candidate to the candidates through the wild card is Kirill Alexeyenko, the young Russian player who has finished third in the Grand Swiss, big Grand Swiss tournament, right? The Isle of Man Grand Swiss, which had one qualification spot for the winner, one how, and then it had one, I don't know, wild card spot, right? So the first unqualified, the first who is not yet qualified, and that happened to be Kirill Alexeyenko, who has taken third. And yeah, and it's been a lot of stuff said about Maxime Vachier-Lagrave deserving this wild card more, and yeah, not in the mood to go to discuss it any further. Yeah, I agree with a lot of those arguments, but at the same time, it was all in hands of Maxime Vachier-Lagrave just to qualify himself. So what has happened after Rook FD8 was knight back to, let me update it. Yeah, knight back to F3 and white guards the bishop on D2, moves the knight from G5 and black returns to D3 himself. So I believe we switched back to the line that I was thinking of, yeah, when I was saying like, put the knight back to D3. I suspect in case of knight F3, I would have played Rook D8 as well. So strangely, Navarra finds it harder to find specific moves. Because, you know, coming back to this topic of this position being like two results play only, not necessarily. I mean, if you somehow miss out on very precise moves, and black's gonna imagine black somehow gets the rook on c2. It might be the situation where black wins the pawn back, and still the position is not, well, it's not simplified completely. And in this case, black having more active pieces will be just better, which doesn't guarantee the win. But yeah, so white still has to be careful. I don't think white is any worse or something, but has to be careful. Rook fd1 perhaps allows the repetition. Let me find out. So knight b2. Rook f1 doesn't help, rook e1 doesn't help, so the only try, yeah, the rook is hanging. So the only try is to go to c1 and try to lift the rook on the c file. That's the only thing I can think about. Otherwise, it's just a repetition, right? Or accepting the position tempo down, which is not what you want to do. Yeah, and say if you play rook c2, I'm guessing knight e5 is supposed to be strong because c2 rook's hanging. In case of rook takes c8, black probably swaps on f3 first, then takes rook c8, threatens rook c2. What do you do about that? Maybe it's not such a big threat. I'm not sure if it's something to be scared of. But say bishop e3, rook c2, the knight's hanging, the pawn on a2 hanging. Oh, well, an ugly move like like knight c1, for the time being, actually keeps the pawn on a2 alive, because if you trade on c1 and take on a2, you are getting checkmated. But yeah, but typically, yeah, it kind of keeps the material equal for now, but or rather extra pawn for white for now. But typically, with such ugly moves, you can't really hope for an advantage. And I'm guessing funny-looking knight e1 is good for black in this case. Just look at white pieces. This is not moving, and this is not moving. You know, f3 is hanging. After bishop a7, all of a sudden, the rook on b1 is getting trapped. So I believe if something like this happens, like if black gets an active rook on c2, it's already white who will have to care about draw. So rook fd, let me update it. Rook fd1 being the last move played, where he is thinking. Yeah, it does seem to be, yeah, knight b2 does seem to be good enough for equality. Or, wait a second, should I check it again? Because there is also rook c4, the move I've kind of forgotten about, which allows white to capture on e5 after knight e5, and it's a different situation, of course. Because after bishop e5, white is actually not forced to capture on c8. And might try another move. So in order to force white to trade the rooks, you'll have to capture on e5 with the knight, but then white captures on c8, and the fact that the black knight left d3 square allows white to play rook c1. That actually works for white, yeah. That's a better version. So it could be that you don't want to play knight b2 here because of that line. Yeah, so that the rook goes to c1. If you return back to d3, it's rook c4, and this way, yeah, this white is getting some is making some progress. Right, people in chat saying knight c6 to b4 being the best move. Yeah, well, fair enough. It's one of the moves to consider. I'm sure. The other thing could be knight e5, knight takes, bishop takes. Once again, keeping the idea of playing rook to c2. No, but knight c6 to b4, precisely as chat has mentioned, that's the best move for black. Happens to be the best move for black. a2 pawn is hanging, and it's not clear if white is able to defend it. It's not clear if white is able to defend it. a3 or a4, right? I mean, trading on b4, trading on d8 is not such an attractive option typically, even though white does keep his extra pawn for now. Well, I won't provide like too many variations. I do believe that black has to have enough compensation. One important note though, typically if you are left with knight versus the bishop in some structures like that, you want your pawn to be on e3 and not on e4, because potentially f2 is a juicy target to attack, you know, like knight d3, and if the bishop ever gets to d4, I mean to this a7 g1 diagonal. So having the pawn on e3 would, it's actually white who would benefit from that in this particular case. So knight cb4, yeah, I suspect a3 is what you do. a3, let's say, and now it's a big question, because knight c2 sort of runs into bishop a5. And it's awkward. Is it though? Maybe knight a3 is what you... Knight a3, bishop takes... I know it doesn't work. Doesn't work for black. Because in case of rook d8, that's a pin, so the rook can run away to the c file. If you capture on b1, it's rook d3, guarding the bishop, c1's covered. So yeah, so bishop a5 will be, in fact, very unpleasant for black to face, because if you lift the rook, that means the d3 knight is sort of pinned. I mean, if you put it on d7, the knight is actually pinned for real, right? You can't move to like f2 or b2 because the rook on d7 will be hanging. With rook on d6, once again, it slows down black quite significantly. Even though maybe in this very position, it's problematic to guard a3. It's very, very tactical, this one. Knight f4 on depth 29. Oh well, let's see. Knight f4 on depth 29. But with what variation? That's the question. Because knight f4, I suspect. Ah, you mean like I can't trade on f4 because of this. Fair enough. Yeah. And if black captures on a2, I suspect it's bishop a5. That's the tactical justification of this one. Yeah, might be knight f4. Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a nice move, seemingly. Trying to keep up with the chat. Chat discussing the potential match between Magnus Carlsen and anyone else, like VE for some reason, even though VE can't make it to the candidates. Yeah, interestingly, I believe Magnus himself, a few years ago, mentioned VE as like a uprising prominent power and like potential candidate for the title. But and by that point, they were more or less on par with Ding Liren. So those were two Chinese stars. And for instance, 2015, the World Cup in Baku, which was eventually won by Sergei Karyakin, those Chinese players, they faced each other in the quarterfinal, if I'm not mistaken, and Wei won the match against Ding Liren. Yeah, so quarterfinal or last 16 possibly, but I do remember like two of those guys facing each other. For the time being, it's out of question. I believe Ding Liren is much stronger. Yeah, so people who type in the chat Ding Liren is a serious contender. I fully support you. Okay, so a3 plate. They went for my line. a3, knight to c2, bishop a5, rook d6. So it turns out rook d6 holds for black, or at least that's what Wei is thinking. Well, actually, yeah, I was saying that after bishop a5, it's awkward for black. Now that I'm looking at it, White has to do something about this knight a3 threat, because it's not only this way black not only wins the pawn back, but traps the rook from b1. It might be the moment that you actually have to, try to return the pawn and simplify in some way. Yeah, and confirming on this, people say a3 was a mistake, and now it's black who's better. Interesting. Okay, yeah, so one thing that I can say, bishop b4, kind of a panicky move. So basically, I'm fine with returning the pawn, but I don't want to lose an exchange on b1. Yeah, bishop b4, black captures twice. And because of, well, actually, I wanted to say because of rook c2 threat, black's supposed to be somewhat better, but there is rook c1. So I don't really think black is all that much better, because in this case, white does get some squares for himself, right? Rook c4 if black decides to keep the rooks on the board. And typically, if you... rook c2 is still stupid. If you trade, it kind of takes away a lot of sharpness from the position. You really need the rooks, I mean, in order to do something. So now we can speculate that the bishop is better than the knight in this position, but without the rooks, it can't do much. It really can't do much. So you need the rooks for either side. I mean, if white's better, still he would need the rook to prove it. Now for black, he'd need the rooks to prove it. Yeah, so bishop b4 might be kind of a way to bail himself out of trouble for David Navarra. But of course, you don't like such moves. You don't like playing such moves. So you pawn up, you give your opponent the bishop, right, and you return the pawn. e5 or a4? e5, yes, I was thinking of it. It's just that after this capture, I'm not sure what White's supposed to do. You probably... No, wait a second. What do you do? How do you hold your a3 guy? Oh, you trade on e5. You trade on d6. Suppose black captures with the bishop and you go a4. Yeah, fair enough. This probably holds. But again, it's only black who can be better, right? I mean, as long as white pawns are not on b5, a5, as long as white is not creating the passed pawn somewhere very, very far advanced, typically the kingside majority and the fact that those pawns can be moved and control squares in the center is more important than having the outside passed pawn. With the less pieces you would have, the more important the outside passed pawn would become, and especially like in the pawn endgame, yes, A and B pawns are, would be that would be a huge advantage for white, right? I mean, if white can create an outside passed pawn, but being as it is with some pieces on the board, I still think it's black who is better, if anyone. After rook d6, white replied with b4. That's surprising, I have to say. So not e5, not rook d2. Yeah, there was also rook d2 mentioned in the chat, which, to be honest, I don't quite understand, because at the very least, black has bishop h6, targeting the rook. Does it mean that white already in such a desperate situation that he has to just leave the rook and then go back? Or maybe e5 in this case. Yeah. Okay, so b4 played by David Navarra, obviously prepared to play rook b3 in case of knight a3. However, the question is, what do you do after knight c1? Do you actually resign? Do you actually resign after knight c1? Trick being obviously white can't take because he's getting checkmated on the first rank. Is there anything apart from rook b3? Not really. The rook's attacked. On c1 will be taken. On a1 will be taken. After e5, yeah, we're about to find out. Knight a3, rook b3 played. Let's see. The 3 rook b3. So what's the answer to knight c1? There should be some. I don't think Navarra has blundered that badly. I'd rather think that I'm blind and there is a resource for white. You can take over here. After which, well, this is better for black. No, not really. There is rook d8. That's important, because I wanted to say that this should be better for black. I mean, if white leaves, rook d3 still runs into this knight c1. Yeah, if white leaves, there should be some rook c2 sooner or later. Yeah, but at the very least, there is rook d8 for black. Okay, we do the other thing. We capture on d6 with the pawn. White still can't take the knight on c1, but he can take the other knight. Knight e2, king to f1, and knight f4, for instance. Still, black is much more active. Knight c1 played and rook d6 played. Wait a second, where's the... that's the wrong line. That's the wrong line. Knight a3, rook b3, knight to c1 played, rook to d6 played. Maybe after all, black needs to capture on b3, allow the trade, because seemingly he's still not worse in this case. Might even be better, because it's really tough to say. So depends on black's ability to surround the b pawn very quickly. And the annoying fact is that e7 is hanging. So I was considering like going knight c2, but in this case bishop captures e7 and actually protects the b4 pawn. I'll see. Now, where he decides to capture on d6. Rook takes a3, knight e2 check, king f1, and I suspect knight f4 needs to be played. Knight c3. While actually same idea, maybe a better idea. No, it's not the same idea. Wanted to say the idea of back rank mate, but the rook is not able to jump over the pieces just yet. So rook c1 is not a legal move. Knight c3 attacks e4 pawn, and then the knight might be put on b5. And notice, guys, the bishop on a5 now will be completely out of play when black's going to put the knight on b5. Well, actually, white is in quite a bit of trouble. White is in quite a bit of trouble, I believe. We might already start saying about black having an advantage. So it's certainly not two results game. Yeah, that's the answering. Well, the reacting to the chats. You guys keep making points one after the other, and I agree that the best rook endgame is actually when you have the rook and your opponent doesn't. Yeah, so that's very absolutely fair. Let's see. Yeah, Navarro himself finds it problematic to reply to knight c3, because indeed the bishop on a5 is getting stuck. Can we see the clock? Yeah, let's try. Let's try. I like your assumption, guys, that we have a cameraman. We don't. That's you know, that's a robot. So we can't tell the robot to focus on the clock, regrettably. But we'll try to do something. Yeah, the reflection is terrible. It seems like 10 minutes for Navarro, right? Still, yeah, this 25 plus 10. It should not be underestimated how lot of time that is, in fact. Because it seems they've started to play very, very fast. And it seemed like, yeah, perhaps the guys are very low on time. But in fact, yeah, still 10 minutes for David Navarro after all the time he has spent. B4, B5 played. Precisely as I said, the bishop would be in such a terrible shape on a5. And other thing to mention, perhaps there was no way, I thought there was no comfortable way to guard e4. Maybe there was no way to guard e4 period, because after knight d2, knight b5 would have been strong, but even stronger perhaps would have been a simple bishop h6, attacking the knight, and when the knight leaves, black would have taken on e4. Therefore, b5 played. So white already will be a pawn down after that. Knight takes b5, rook a2. White, though, has some positional compensation for the pawn he has lost. So now the bishop comes back to life, the bishop on a5. The a7 pawn will be a target, and so will be the d6 pawn. Right, so now black will have to regroup in some way to solidify the position, and perhaps won't be able to make further progress without entering the game with the king. So I suspect black should be looking for some pieces trade and try to break. Yeah, well, like for instance, knight d4, and let's imagine white cooperates and takes it. Then you take with the bishop. After bishop b4, you still have rook c6, so you keep your stuff together. And then you want to play f6 and bring the king to e6. So your a7 pawn is still alive for now. You can move it to a6 if you want. Maybe that's the way. maybe that's the way. Maybe knight d4. I mean, at least it certainly is the move to consider. Not that it's running away from you, right? Knight d4 should be available on the next move as well. Hang on a second. There is also this. Rook c1 check, and after king e2, you can still go for the knight swap. You can also try to swap the rooks. One step further. You're rook a1. Sometimes that takes away a lot of counterplay. I mean, if you get rid of the rooks and you still have your a pawn available, but maybe black king once again. Remember what we were talking like yesterday, day before yesterday. The more pieces you swap, the more valuable unit the king becomes in terms of activity, right? With a lot of pieces on the board, that's like a really weak creature that needs to be taken care of. But as soon as it gets to an endgame, the game gets to an endgame, and you swap more pieces, the king's influence, the king's participation in the action is needed. And therefore, white's going to use his king to get to d3, c4, possibly d5, and this king from g8 might not be in time to join the action. So therefore, rook c1 and to a1, even though it's considerable, I don't think it is the solution. Rook c1's best, interestingly. Yeah, but maybe not with rook a1 idea, right? c1 check, king e2, and because knight d4 is still kind of valid move, right? Well, white probably has to swap. Ah, no, wait a second. But there is bishop d2. And then if black moves somewhere, bishop e3, that's typically how I would try to make a draw with white. Just get the rook endgame. To rook b7, you go to a6. And you're not that scared anymore. So rook endgame where you have all the active pieces and your opponent's extra pawn is blocked on a7. Edgin suggests king f8, rook c1, rook c4, bishop c3. Let's see. Rook to c4 played. Yeah. Grab more pawns. Fair enough. Rook c4, which was replied with bishop d2. That means rook e4 would be answered with rook a5, attacking the knight, and if the knight leaves, capturing the a7 pawn. So now, the real question will be, after knight d4, rook takes a7, knight takes f3. What's that position? It would seem that black is getting checkmated, but no, it's actually him who is winning the game. That's funny. I mean, because typically this sort of setup with rook on the 8th rank and bishop h6, sometimes your opponent would have a queen, but as long as he cannot protect f8, you're winning. Yeah, but in this particular case, it blunders rook e1 checkmate. So you're probably giving a check, and after bishop f8, you capture the knight on f3. You have no choice. Black has perhaps strictly only moved rook h4 to guard the h6 square. Yeah, and it doesn't work for black, regrettably, because bishop g5 and then bishop e7. Yeah, because if black would have been able to stabilize, he'd actually have decent winning chances. And by stabilizing, perhaps h7, h6 would be just enough, or f7, f5, and then get the king to f7. Let's see. Rook c4, bishop d2, and the rook returns to c6. Honestly, it looks like a loss of a tempo for black. Because now if you think, guys, if black wanted rook c6, a6 setup, he could have started with rook c6, where he sort of threatens the pin. I don't think white's move would have been anything different but bishop d2. And then you could already play a6, or basically just have the same position as in the game, but with yourself to move. So rook c4 feels like a bit of a miss, right, after bishop d2, or rook c6 back. Maybe there was like other forcing variation that black decided not to go for. Rook back to c6. Bishop c3 was best, and it was minus 0.50. Minus 0.50 after bishop c3. So that means after rook c6, the evaluation is even closer to an equality. Yeah, king e2. Once again, coming back to the discussion from a couple of days ago, the quote-unquote easy to prove compensation for the pawn, or for material in general, is that when you don't need to invent anything out of this world. If you only, I mean, if you play the natural moves, and it's enough, right? And so far, after white decided to give a pawn, basically, you can call it a pawn sacrifice, because there was no need to give away the b pawn, right? After white sacrificed the b pawn, so far he's playing reasonably easy to find moves. King e2, king f8. We probably put the king on d3, so king like one square away from the knight on diagonal assures that, I mean, at least it doesn't run into any kind of forks. Yeah, king d3 seems to be a nice square to put the king on. King d3, a6 played, bishop goes to b4. Already having some ideas connected with e4, e5. King to e8 and knight d2, now transferring the knight to c4. Later on, possibly 3 d5 if needed, but on c4 it's already a good piece. Yeah, I feel like white managed a very good regroup of the pieces. It turns out rook c1 check or rook c6 were only moves for an advantage for black. So once again, if we are talking about this position, right? So rook c1, I don't know what had to be the follow-up after king e2, which is natural, or, as we've discussed, rook c6, very likely white would have replied with the same with bishop d2, and then basically the position from the game with a tempo up, which actually helps, right? He could have started playing king f8 the same way as he did in the game. It's just that white would have the king on f1 instead of having it on e2. And now after knight d2, black is still up a pawn, but he'll have, I believe, will have difficulties converting this one. Bishop c3, bishop takes, knight takes instead of rook c6. Yeah, we could take a look at this one. So after rook c3 and bishop d2, bishop c3, swap here, knight takes. White captures a7, you capture e4. This does look like something. White might have rook c2 though. Might have rook c2. So that this pin is sort of annoying. Or not really, yeah. Rook a7, knight e4, it's definitely a chance. It's hard to win once again because white is very active, but it's a pawn, and black would have kept trying. So now after knight d2, king to d7 played by Wei. Very quick response with knight c4 by David Navarra. So now with knight on c4 instead of f3, white is getting an extra option of pushing his king side forward. It's a draw no matter what black plays. Well, once again, if we have two computer programs running and playing this position against each other on a decent hardware, yeah, then I would accept this one as a valid point. But with two human players playing, I don't know what's going to happen. Bishop d4 seemingly allows for the simplifications. No, that'll be an embarrassing way to blunder. Knight d6, knight d6 after king d4. Black has a check from c4. That's the problem. So bishop d4 is a legit move, in fact. Perhaps wants it on c5. The engine suggests it's equal now. Okay. It's a first rapid, yeah. It's a first rapid. So people in the chat asking if it's a first game. Yeah, it's game one. It's game 1, 25 plus 10, and still, well, still not, you know, still not blitzing out. So there is still time on the clock, and I can't stress it enough. So I'll repeat it. It's a really tough transition for the players from the classical chess to the rapid chess, and then from 10 plus 10 to the blitz, because different increment. So over there, I mean, it's very easy to understand. Previously you had, well, an hour and a half. Now you have only 25 minutes. That's very easy to understand. You're aware of that. You're looking at the clock. But the pace that you, yeah, I mean, the pace you move the pieces, then time trouble changes, right? So in a classical game, you've blitzed out few moves. You have a couple of minutes on the clock. Now it's only 10 seconds increment. And when you transition to this 5 plus 3 blitz, it's even worse, right? Because basically you cannot accumulate enough time. 7 minutes for Navarra and only 2 for VE. How to evaluate this kind of position? So guys already told you the evaluation, right? I mean, I'm afraid that's one of those positions where the raw evaluation will not really help you, right? Like, for instance, people posting evaluations in the chat. It's more of a, yeah, you check the material, what's on the board, you check the threats. Similarly, nothing like immediate goes on. Black is up a pawn, white can't win the pawn, black cannot win immediately, like not that the pawn is marching forward. So you think of potential transformations, like you think for sort of the best square for each piece, what you want to achieve and how to achieve it. Like for instance, this maneuver with bishop d4 and bishop going somewhere. f3 was played by David Navarra, bishop g1 quickly, so just in case black wants to force the h pawn to move. Before, say, after h3, there'll be some additional weaknesses on the dark squares, right? So bishop g1, which Navarra immediately answers with rook a1. Because he's sold on that one. Yeah, he'd be very happy if black captures on h2, rook h1, then win the pawn on h7, target f7. In this case here, rook actually becomes very active. So after rook a1, black replies with bishop d4. Wouldn't mind to repeat the position a couple of times and then, you know, then probably go for something else. Yeah, speaking of evaluation, that's a pretty much on-spot description. So to evaluate the position, first look at the material, then at the pawn structure, then at the threats, tempos, and so on. Well, there'll be more factors if we want to describe the full situation, because sometimes, like, I would not put material as the main factor necessarily, because the activity of the piece is important, the safety of the king is of utmost importance, because sometimes you'd be a couple of queens up, but your king is inevitably checkmated in a couple of moves, you know. Yeah, but on the surface, yeah, if we kind of disregard the fringe case scenarios, yeah, we look at the material. If one side is to the rook up, that kind of hints that he might be better. Yeah, the material, if it's equal, the pawn structure, if it's like one side has insignificant material advantage, then you think, okay, what's the compensation for that? Something like that, yeah. And once again, you don't really need to know the precise engine evaluation, right? You don't really care if the position is 0.4 or 0.8. It doesn't really help you. So what you think, okay, now I'm slightly better, how do I make this advantage bigger? And then you switch to thinking in terms of plans and like not valuing the precisely, like, okay, now it was 130 or 0.31 and let's make it 0.35. No, it doesn't work like that, at least for a human brain. So bishop to a4, bishop to d4 was answered with rook a4, bishop g1 again. That's interesting. Does it mean that after rook a1, black's gonna... No, but he probably won't capture. He probably is planning for bishop c5. That's what I'm thinking. He's probably planning for bishop c5. Let's see what difference the rook on a4 makes. Not that I can see why it is better than... Hang on a second. Rook a1, bishop d4, rook a4. Because Navarra put the rook on a different squares on a4 and a2. That was not very clever by David Navarra, pardon me for criticizing him. But look what happened. After bishop d4, rook went to... So over here, the rook was on a2. After rook a1, bishop d4, the rook for some reason went to a4 and not a2. Because in this case, it would have been already a threefold repetition. But rook a4, that allows black to play bishop d4 once again. Because now rook a4 is the second time and rook a2 is the second. Does that make sense? Yeah. Rook a4, and eventually black, of course, being a pawn up, wants the game to continue. He puts the bishop to e5, g2, g3 played. Wants f4, I suspect black has to play g5. Bishop a7 is, or rather was, the best for black. Could be, but that's such an unnatural move, right? I don't even know what you want with black here. It's like, I'd be looking for some way to play the king to play the king to e6 and try to play d6, d5. But even so, like the pawn on a6 is always weak. It might be that black always has enough compensation. By the way, king e6 is played, so I decided not to try g5, yeah? Not to try to stop f4. f4 played, and bishop returns to g7. So now d5 is an option you have to reckon with. Knight to a5. Oh, that's interesting. Basically, yeah, rook back to c7. I suspect knight back to c4, a6 will be hanging. What do you do about that? Well, perhaps putting the rook on a7. I mean, not much else you can do. I thought that was the point David Navarra was making, because after knight a5, you attempted to play an active move, something along the lines of rook c1, but then after knight c4, you are actually unable to guard your a6 pawn, and then king runs into some danger as well. So the rook went back to c7 after knight c4, first back to c6, so he wants to repeat the position one more time, and he goes to c1. But what's that? After knight c4, how he's planning to keep his pawn alive? Not to mention there might be other moves like knight b3, for instance. No, knight c. I kind of prefer knight c4. There's still knight c7, technically. There is still knight c7. Yeah, speaking of Nepomniachtchi's chances to win the finals, I can see a live discussion in the chat. I believe it's like, honestly reminded me of that silly joke, like if it's either happens or doesn't happen, that the probability of it should be 50%. Knight b3, yeah, it was never too late to blunder, because after rook b1, I actually thought king c2, which is embarrassing. Rook b2 and black wins immediately. King c4, and it was played knight to c7. Navarro replies with bishop a5. So now, black... well, can black play d5 here? Which would mean he returns his extra pawn. After white captures, black captures, there is knight c5 check. Knight a6, but maybe there are some threats to this king on c4. I wouldn't be absolutely relaxed with white if something like that happens, because black pieces are, in a way, more designed to take care of the kingside pawns. There might be some silly tactics like bishop c3, for instance. I don't know where it leads, but at the very least, white can capture. Yeah, knight goes to b5. Bishop back to b4, if I didn't miss anything. Knight back to c7, and bishop back to a5. So once again, a threat of threefold repetition kind of pushes black to do something else. Yeah, and if you don't play d5, what do you even do? Knight a8. Brilliant decision to not to allow the repetition. Can put the knight on a8. What's the time? Someone's asking in the chat. Don't you have it on your computer screen? And if you mean the time on the clock, let's try to find out together. d5 played. Yeah, so we're about to see this position. And I want, once again, guys, I would really not call it a draw just yet, even if your computer engine shows it's absolutely equal, because that's the position both sides can make mistake in. I wouldn't call it a draw. It might be an equal position, but hang on a second. How do you make a draw here? Yeah, the important point being that no longer you can play bishop d2 because there is knight b6, yeah? Interesting. So I suspect you give knight c5. And maybe you don't take on a6, but then there are threats, right? Check king d6 played. No, he does take on a6. Yeah, but that might be awkward, because now black is absolutely safe, right? There is not a single threat. So black might as well, start attacking the kingside pawns, using the fact that both the knight on a6, the bishop on a5 for the time being are not ideal pieces. Still advantage for black. Yeah, well, at least, for the two human players playing, that certainly is the position where black is fighting for an advantage and white has to defend carefully. Yeah, like for instance, what do you do after rook b2? Threat being very simple. Just wanna capture the pawn on h2. There might be the moment where you actually surrender the h2 pawn, like playing bishop b4 with a check, where black captures, you capture with the knight. After rook h2, you try to come up with some sort of a counterplay, like rook a6 and knight d5, and try to pretend that it's a perpetual. Yeah, bishop b4 played, in fact, because it's so awkward. Yeah, knight takes, yeah, that's what's happening. Now black has to take on h2, I'm guessing. And we'll see what white comes up with. Rook takes h2 played. Yep. There is also rook a7 on an immediate, not giving a check, but Navarra decided to come up with, yeah, so check on a6, king to d7. It's pretty much the same. Bishop b4 was the best move. Interesting. Was knight b6 a threat? Answering, yeah. It's like instead of rook b2, well, technically knight b6 would have gotten black the bishop versus knight, but again, it's like if black is to move again and he is the one who plays rook b2, we'd get pretty much the same position as in the game. Here, white is just on time to play knight b4 and shut down this rook on b6, so it's kind of the open part of the board, but still restricted with white pieces with its own king, and then rook a6 is the threat to swap the rooks. So in this case, black is still better, but white's chances would have been, I mean, white chances for a draw would have been much higher. Instead, yeah, let's switch to the game. So check king to d7. The knight is on d3, so that's the knight d3 was played. Rook check on c2. King goes to d5. Rook c7. I don't like this rook c7. Knight e5 check. Let's see. There is always an option to go for the rook endgame. I'm wondering if there is anything else, to be honest, because king e7, knight c6, you can't really run away from the perpetual. Yeah, king f6 obviously not being a very attractive option, at the very least because of knight d4 and then going back. So in fact, after knight e5, black decided to capture. King takes e5. I'm guessing that should be good enough. Good enough for a draw. King e7, let's see. g4, yeah, brilliant. g4, g5. Just stop those pawns. So it's only one pawn, plus white pieces are very active. I suspect it won't be possible to win. Rook to c4. Trick being black wants to play f6 if given a chance. I don't see how black, I mean, what black does after g5. I think it's just a draw, right? And if white plays g5. There is also this silly move, rook a7 check, so that after king f8 there is f5. Yeah, check and f5. Yeah, I was wondering if at some point it actually gets awkward for black. For instance, here. And then you lose control, you give a check on g5, and then you might as well resign after king d6 because it's a checkmate. f5, rook c5 check. Hang on a second. King d6. With f6 to follow. I mean, I don't think white ever starts to play this one for a win, but you can't really win with black as well. Rook c7 felt like it was a bit too passive. King to f6, rook d6 check. Okay, king back to king to g5. Fair enough. Now, at the very least, black can play king g7 and try to play this one on. So the game's going to continue. The game's going to continue, right? After king g7. Yep, played. White captures on g6, h g6. Yeah, it's still a draw, and then yeah, you just keep the rook like that. Rook c4. It's a nice maneuvering, but yeah, the f7 pawn is pinned, right? Okay, 7, rook to e4, rook b7, king f8. But no threat, once again, no threat whatsoever. No threat whatsoever. White can win. Yeah, I mean, any side can win if we are talking of like a blundering the rook or losing on time. But Other than that, it's a very, 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 very solid draw. Now back to b7. Yeah, you don't need to invent anything. Rook e7. Okay. Okay. So black gets the 7th rank. He will be able to push the f-pawn 1 square forward. That's about it. That's about the only achievement. And he probably has to do it right now, because otherwise white goes g5 and that's it. Yeah. So f6 played. Now, well, perhaps g5 is a draw, but this is what you have to do with care, because now potentially black will have an idea of going rook e4, rook g4. It's still a draw, I believe. You just go back to f3 and then make sure to attack the g6 pawn all the time, so that black doesn't have such liberty as going with the rook. The moment black leaves the 7th rank, you give billion checks and then playing rook b6 in the right moment. Yeah, but there was no need to go g5. Navarra decided to put the rook on b6. Rook to c7. Yeah, let me update them. Far behind, it seems. The king is already on f2. I don't think it does make sense to analyze that one all that much from a, on the analysis board. It is a draw unless something bad happens to white, right? So let's maybe concentrate on the camera view. Let's see how much time is left. I mean, that's like, we must be dealing with just like few seconds on each player's clock. Yeah, the angle is far from perfect, of course. It's more than a minute, it seems, for BE, and Navarre is down to 20 seconds. All right, so now, after... Yeah, it's just a draw, because after king e5, white does have g5. To this check, what do they do? I mean, if you don't go king e6, it means your king's cut on the last rank. You can prolong the game for as much as you like, but all rook endgames are drawn until they aren't. Oh, well, fair enough. And g5's played. Ah, fair enough. So now, if f5, white has an immediate draw by attacking the g6 pawn. If the king guards it, then give a check on the 7th rank and then back to attacking the g6 pawn. And if f6 takes g5, then just keep the king in front of the g pawn. It's enough. Yeah, this seems to be a draw. King e8. What's king e8? Rook b6. Ah, no. I mean, that's not serious. That's not serious. It's just a try to swap everything. Rook f6. Rook takes f4. Rook g7. And now the rooks will be traded. It's a third game in a row where both players left with, with the bare kings. And Navarra even plays king e4. The very, very last move. That's lovely. That's lovely. So it is a draw, but one thing you can't do, you can't really blame those players for not willing to fight. And one of the longest 25 plus 10 games so far, I believe, has taken almost 1 hour and 20, while the time allocated for each of those rapid games is 1 hour 30. So basically, it's an awkward moment on what to do between those tiebreak games, because they have the official starting times, and sometimes you have like half an hour before the next game starts, and you just don't know what to fill the time with. And as for now, it's very convenient. We've already covered the end game. Yeah, I mean, maybe some of you people need more explanations. Let's see what we can do, but not now. Now it's a time to, for the players and for me as the commentator to take a little breather. Coming back in 10 minutes, I believe, not more than 10 minutes because the next game is going to start very, very soon. Stay tuned. Game 2 of tiebreak playoff between Navarre and VE is coming up. Welcome back, everybody. We continue with the tiebreak of the semi-finals. We only have one match to remind you. We have the finalist, who is Jan Nepomniachtchi, already waiting to play the final against one of the guys who are taking part in the tiebreak right now. 3 draws, 2 classical games were drawn, and first rapid 25+10 game was drawn between David Navarra and VE. In all of those games, the end was with 2 Bear Kings being on the board. So one thing we cannot accuse those players of is their willingness. I mean, they do want to play. It's just that, you know, the game itself seems to be the state of the game nowadays, that the defense tends to prevail. And yeah, now that I'm trying to think of, were there any like realistic chances is one of the games? Yeah, perhaps the last rapid is the only game where one of the sides has gotten a significant advantage. So VE was up a pawn with black at some point, with some chances perhaps to convert. But yeah, that's the moment where Navarra precisely has started to demonstrate a very, very good skills of combining defense with the counter-attack. So the game 2 has started once again. The somewhat slow-played opening. I believe in the first game, game 1, we've seen something very, very similar. So like 2-3 moves were played relatively slowly, and then they sped up and you know, played another 10 with the kaleidoscopic speed whenever they've transferred into something known. Now the opening knight f3, d5, b3 kind of suggests that he simply wants the middle game. He doesn't really want to compete with Navarra's opening knowledge. So it'll be much slower played game. So once again, knight f3, d5, b3. I mean, you probably opt for some sort of Queen's Indian setups more than anything. Oh no, not really. So bishop to f5, bishop b2, e7, e6. Oh, wait a second, bishop f5, bishop b2, e7, e6. Now what I thought you could try for e3, d3, knight d2, you know, well, maybe e3 and c4 would have been a legit way to play. White starts with d2, d3. So we'll see a transposition to so-called Reti opening. Let me update on the moves they've played. After d3, that's interesting. David Navarra immediately plays h7, h6, because that's an eternal debate in this kind of developing for black, which in a way, yeah, c6 very likely is going to be played by black. Knight to d7, knight to f6. There's bishop somewhere, e7 or d6, and castle short. So if you think of it, it's a London system black is playing, with colors reversed, with, you know, tempo down, which does not matter all that much in such setups. And there's always a question, do you spend a tempo on h7, h6, or for white, yeah, once again with colors reversed, well, basically to remind you what London system looks like. It's d4, knight f6, you develop the bishop to f4, and then you go e3, knight f3, actually postpone, moving the c-pawn. And then, yeah, the moment comes and you ask yourself, do I want to play h3 to be able to go with the bishop to h2, or I'll just keep developing? Right, and Navarra answers this question to himself very, very early as move 4. h6, knight bd2, knight f6, white goes g2, g3. And that's the stuff I used to play some time ago when I still played chess. So-called Reti double fianchetto, right, setup. So you put the bishops on b2 and g2, you castle, and then you, yeah, let's see what happens. g3, c5 is a bit of a surprise, to be honest. I would expect bishop e7, bishop g2, because that would be a standard way of playing it. And then white might go for c4, rook c1, rook to c2, queen to a1, other rook to c1 setup, which is known from the times of Richard Reti himself, the inventor of the Reti opening. Or white can try for e2, e4. That's another legit way of playing it. In our game, black replied with c7, c5, and interestingly, Wei plays knight e5 immediately, trying to prevent a natural development, because now in case of knight c6, the fact that those pawns are getting doubled is something black won't enjoy all that much. Because then bishop g2 happens, white plays e4. Basically, black's structure will be far less mobile, far less flexible with those c-pawns being doubled. Therefore, knight goes to d7. Now white has a chance to support the knight on e5 with the other knight. Just like you can go knight d2 to f3. You can continue developing your stuff by going bishop g2. Honestly, the whole setup of, developing the bishop to f5 against the Reti after g3 was considered, it was kind of connected with playing c6 and not c5. Point being that you want this bishop to be passive, so you kind of build a sort of a fence in the way of this. It's basically strengthen this diagonal as much as possible. Because after c5, knight e5, knight d7, that's the position we have. Even a simple trade, bishop g2, if it ever comes to white playing c4 or e4, and black reacting to it in some way by trading his d-pawn, it kind of doesn't go well together. The fact that black developed the bishop to f5, and the fact that he has played his c-pawn forward 2 squares. So now, let's do it. Castles, let's imagine c4. If something like this happens, I'm not necessarily saying that it's a terrible position for black. It is a playable position still. But the bishop on f5 does close to nothing as far as white doesn't touch his e-pawn, right? So bishop on f5 is passive. Bishop on g2 has some, some potential targets. And it's tough for black to oppose this bishop in some way. So you would actually perhaps prefer your bishop on c8, so at the very least you would be able somewhere to play b6, bishop b7, rather than having the bishop on f5. But that's of course a bit simplistic explanation. It has a few more layers to that. One of them being, of course, that after c4, black is by no means forced to capture on c4. That's just a bad move. So you can go d4, that's one thing. You might want to try to keep the pawn on d5. But somehow the feeling is that developing the bishop on f5 is typically connected with c7, c6, and not c7, c5. That's the point I'm trying to make. Very interesting. After knight d7, e2, e4 played. Very, very aggressive move. Point being, of course, that if you capture on e4, the bishop from f1 goes not to g2 but to b5. So once again, the absence of bishop on the absence of the c8 bishops, so that it is on f5, will be quite felt on the queen side. So after e4, Navarra goes for bishop h7, after which knight takes d7, queen takes d7 played, so white managed to play e4, and now quite a few options. Bishop g2 being the most natural, of course, but I'm starting to consider some moves which would be an attempt to punish black immediately. Go e5, for instance, force the knight to g8, and then try to open up the center as soon as possible. Interestingly, if you just play e5 and pretend nothing happened, or just continue playing your game, it would turn out that the black benefits from that. Because now the e5 pawn blocks your own bishop, right? Blocks your own bishop. It's kind of the pawn is in the way. And c2, d3 are not very flexible as well. I mean, because at some point you might want to go d4, but yeah, the moment you go d4, you're opening the diagonal for the bishop from from h7, right? So now it actually is good for black to have the bishop on h7 and not on c8, where it would have been passive. So I don't think e5 is actually a move, even though it does seem to win a tempo, right? Yeah, people claim e5 being the move. Yeah, well, it could be, but once again, if you play e5, you'd better know what do you do next. Because, yes, black will have some serious lack in development, because also kind of both of his kingside minor pieces need e7 square to operate. So it'll be knight, very likely knight e7, then to c6, and only then bishop e7. So white kind of really gets ahead in development, but structure-wise, it's a very decent structure for black, so white will actually have to prove something very quickly if he decides for e4, e5. He might as well just, you know, just keep the position as is. Like go bishop g2, castle short, go queen e2. Once again, the bishop on g2 will be arguably more active than the bishop on h7. And yeah, and perhaps I have to mention that this, like d4, d5, d4, is practically never good. That's once again, that's a weird thing to say, because for the computer engines, that's the move that computer likes a lot typically. I mean, in terms of the structure, but now we are more or less talking King's Indian structure, right? Potentially white castles goes for f4, and by King's Indian standards, white perhaps made a stupid move developing the bishop on b2 because it belongs back to c1, but what black did is ridiculous. This bishop has nothing to do on h7. It's just terrible there. So I don't think black ever considers going d4. Bishop g2 played. Let's find out. It's once again, it might be that black will end up playing d4, but it'll be a sign that his position is already not great. Bishop g2. Oh, well, it's actually a clever thing now that I'm thinking of, because if we start ruling out black's possibilities one after the other, you don't want to take. That's for certain. I mean, having this kind of structure is already, it does already look very promising for white, and the way the pieces are placed, it's actually once again very good for white, because in this case you want to have the knight on c6 so you'd be able to jump it to d4. That's one thing. So knight is like a maximal distance away from d4. The bishop on h7 once again does nothing. White actually can retailor his plan in this case and go f3, return the bishop here, and those pawns on f3 and e4 will just shut down the bishop for good on h7. So under no circumstances you want to take with black. I mean, unless you capture on e4 and will be winning the pawn the very next move. So this is other question. If, yeah, d4, as I said, that at the very least looks like a very, very good version of the King's Indian. And bishop e7, at the very least, white can switch back to this e5 plan, and then black has played bishop in e7 before kind of letting the knight go to c6. So it's an obstacle for this knight to move, right? So bishop g2 was a clever way to play, and to, you know, to illustrate how awkward Navarro's position is, look at the move he played. Queen d7 to d8. You still have the bishop on f8 undeveloped. You still have your king in the center, and you go back to d8. Yeah, precisely. Like if you move the queen to d8, it simply means that your position is awkward, right? It's not necessarily like it's terrible, but it certainly is awkward. E takes d5, releasing the tension. I would think like a bit premature, perhaps, because black still can take with the knight. Capturing with the pawn is not recommended. I'm guessing Wait, what do we do if black captures with the pawn? And actually, David does it. Perhaps other, yeah, so two captures. Yeah, after knight d5, now that I'm thinking, yeah, perhaps just castle short. You don't need to refute it immediately. The fact that the pawn on g7 is hanging, so black can't develop normally, and he cannot return the knight because the other pawn is hanging. That already shows that white would have a serious advantage here. But after e takes d5, yeah, I was about to suggest queen e2. Well, you could castle short. That's another version. Like castle short, in case of bishop e7, you could actually play stuff like that. Queen f3, castles rook e1, for instance. Once again, the fact that bishop is on h7 is really bad for black. Why I'm moving the rook to e1? Because at some point I wanna capture on f6 and then d5, right? Just to make sure that the rook on a1 is not hanging. So this looks attractive, but queen e2 might be even more challenging, right? So ed5, ed5, check on e2. Black has to, I mean, unless he's willing to go king d7, which you guess what cannot be good. Even after simple castle, one of the sides. I'm not sure if castle long is required. I would probably still go with castle short. Yeah, so after bishop e7, it allows white to trade on e7. Trade on f6, pardon. Bishop f6, gf6. So the pawn structure is damaged. The bishop on h7 is still a terrible, terrible piece. So white naturally castles short. Very next move, perhaps. Oh, well, you have rook e1, but also queen f3 as an idea to target d5 and either cause more light square weaknesses, like provoking the pawn to d4. That's a terrible position for black. I'm guessing, yeah, and yeah, people posting the evaluations in the chat +2. Yeah, not surprised at all. Not surprised at all. Yeah, queen e7 might have been. Let's find, yeah, it certainly was the alternative after queen e2. So after queen e7, I suspect it's the same, but worse. Bishop f6, doesn't matter if you trade on e2 or just take back on f6 immediately, white wins the d5 pawn. So same damage done to a structure, plus wins the pawn, yeah, so queen e7 wasn't really a good version. So I suspect objectively, okay, queen d8 is not a great move, but maybe he still had to take on d5 with the knight and try to play this position. At least I don't see how black is supposed to fall apart immediately in this case. While in our game, yeah, let's follow the game. Let's see what happens, because Wei develops a very, very dangerous initiative here. Bishop to f5, rook a1, bishop e6, queen h5, and after queen d7, Wei comes up with a sacrifice on e6. That's a disaster for black. Queen e6, bishop d5, then will capture on f7. I'm guessing Wei is a few moves away from qualifying to the first Grand Prix final of his life. I mean, that's how it looks. So already a pawn for an exchange, plus f7 hanging, b7 hanging. Then, I mean, even from positional standpoint, imagine white gets this knight on f5. Who cares about this bishop on e7? Rook fe1 was +3 instead of what? Yeah. I mean, it's still much better for white. I don't know if... Yeah, okay, queen d7 played. I'm guessing, yeah. Bishop d5, queen back to d7. So now it's only a matter of precision for white. Because one of the dangerous things in chess when your position is that good that you actually start off thinking, is there any move that I'm not winning? And you want to, kind of show off. And sometimes it's like it's uncontrollable. I don't know if you guys kind of believe me, but sometimes in a really high-profile event where the only thing you want is to be efficient, you don't really want to show off. But there is still this thought now, every now and again, especially when the position is like dominating, and think, okay, let's win in style. And this is already dangerous. That's when it starts to get wrong. So now the question for me is like to be very, very precise, because still there is a saying, like the hardest thing is in chess is to win the winning position, which we have no doubt he has. You probably take on f7, not because you really want this pawn, but to prevent black from castling long. I believe that is important. That is important. Yeah, so bishop f7. Yeah, precisely. Bishop takes f7. Let's see. King d8, perhaps. Have to try to work towards the long castle, even with, you know, in an artificial way. King c7, move the rook, run to b8, so that at least your king's going to be safe. So now for white, it's a choice to try to, you know, go for a kill somehow, or try to grab as many pawns as possible. Rook e1, okay, makes sense. You want your rook in play. Black supposedly goes king c7, not that he can do, not that he has that many moves. So king c7, I believe, has to be played. Knight's going to go to c4, right? I know, bishop check. Oh, that's interesting. No, not the check, obviously. Yeah, bishop e6. Bishop attacks the queen. Yes. So that's an awkward spot, in fact. The fact that in some lines the e7 bishop's going to be hanging, and queen d6 runs into knight c4 with the tempo. So perhaps you'll have to play queen d8, but that's, once again, that's a very, very sad, it's a very, very sad move. What's the score between Wei and Nepo, people ask. I don't quite remember, but I do remember Nepo has won a tiebreak against Wei during Moscow Grand Prix. So it shouldn't be that bad for Nepo. This is winning, precisely. So bishop e6, doesn't matter where the queen's going, we probably play knight c4. Let's see, maybe Wei will show us a spectacular way to win this position. He doesn't need the spectacular one, he needs the, you know, the most convincing one, I want to say. +8, oh well, it's good to know. That means that, I mean, white probably has some maneuver that improves his position even further. I would not really, I mean, if you go purely by head count, the material's equal, right? Black has the rook, for which white has the knight and a couple of pawns. With black pieces being that badly placed, with white being that active, I would expect this position to be like up to +3 in computer evaluation terms. But to know that this one is like +8, it's really, really impressive. So that means, yeah, white perhaps has, white has the way to improve his position even further. But once again, even without the knowledge that somewhere very, very deep in a long computer line, computer shows that white is like completely winning. Look at the position. Once again, we come back to precisely the same point I'm continuing making. White doesn't need to invent anything out of this world. He plays usual normal moves. So knight d2 to c4, knight closer to the center, rook f1 to e1, the rook to the open file. And yet he's, I mean, he continues creating threats, he continues attacking. So that usually is a very, very good sign. a7, a6. Well, it's harder and harder to suggest moves when I know that it's supposed to be +8. So you're typically looking for like something really forcing. That, yeah, well, I suspect bishop d5 isn't bad, and it was played. I hope it was. Yeah, bishop to d5. I do trust. I don't trust all the chat evaluations. I know I'm allowed to trust anonymous evaluations because he has like a really, really powerful access to really, really powerful stuff. And I mean, typically it's a very, very deep analysis. And yeah, in this position, yeah, if I'd be checking on my, say, on my laptop in the studio, it would give the evaluation I was coming up with, like +2, +3, right? It's clear that White's initiative is worth something. It's clear that Black's position is very, very tough, but knowing that it's +8 after some moves makes it clear White's winning. Bishop d5, yeah, well, and look what happens. Basically, White plays, as we said, all the natural moves. Black, in order not to fall apart, in order not to lose immediately, look at the stuff he has to do. a6, rook a7. I mean, with king still being on c7. And okay, let's look for the killer move. Well, actually, queen f7, yeah. Queen f7 seems to be good enough. Rook e8, and now more or less anything, because that's now a very, very serious pin. It's not only the bishop on e7 is pinned by the queen, but also by the e1 rook. Suspect knight a5 supposed to win. Not creating any threats, but Black practically has no moves. The bishop is not moving, the rook's hanging, yeah. King b8 runs into bishop f7 with knight c6 idea. Doesn't feel all that natural, this knight a5, but might be good enough as well. Rook e6 is another move you're looking at. I mean, that's kind of a typical move to progress. Get your rook on a 6th rank once again. Yeah, the bishop on d5 can't be taken in this case because rook e7 and take the queen. And in case of king b8, that's a funny position to look at because Black is completely paralyzed. Just literally completely paralyzed. a5 we answer with bishop c4. So this rook is not, I mean, I'm not sure if any piece is moving. Bishop f3 was the move that I was also considering. I mean, that's a kind of the most straightforward attempt to win the game. Bishop f3 to h5, attack the a8 rook. If rook moves, take the e7 bishop. Completely winning. Yeah, rook e6. C was suggested in the chat as well as queen e6. b5. Once again, you don't want to invent anything as long as you have natural moves. Knight to a5, heading to c6. It's a lower. It's a lower, and I believe if Jan Nepomniachtchi is watching the game, that's about the moment for him to start, preparing against David Navarra. Now, what am I saying? Against VE, of course. Yeah, David Navarra. That was the second sentence, so that David Navarra was fighting very well in this tournament and has played quite a few very, very nice games, but something went terribly wrong for him in this second rapid game on a tiebreak. Why not b5? Yeah, I believe this question in the chat was just answered, right? Why not b5 to open up the rook? Because knight a5 and then knight gets to c6. King b6, knight to c6, about to lose more material. And he resigns, yeah. So move 27, knight c6, and David Navarra decided he had enough. Well, so congrats to VE to making it to the final. It was, for a change, a very, very short tiebreak today. Only 2 rapid games needed. And VE is in the final, and he will face Jan Nepomniachtchi. Once again, credit has to be given to David Navarra, who was fighting in every single game, I believe, of this tournament, who was the player to win match in classics, which is very rare in this particular leg of Grand Prix. So he was the one to knock out Dmitry Yakovenko in round 2. Yeah, and for Wei, yeah, it does seem to be that he has played a very, very nice game too, even though it was rapid, but the quality of his play, Navarabis played it, that's true, but the quality of Wei's play was really remarkable. A model game too, yeah, that kind of, the model attack on how do you do it. Yeah, the reminder that I can see people in the chat asking, the reminder that tomorrow is a one and only free day for the players as well as for myself. The day after tomorrow, the same time, the final's going to start. And once again, let me remind what this final is about. So never mind Nepomniachtchi won his match against MVL in the semi-final. It's still the campaign to qualify for the candidates is still on for both. MVL, however, can't do much about it. He's eliminated. He's probably on his way home to Paris. And Nepo has to win. This time we know his opponent name. Once again, the reminder, Wei wins the tiebreak, goes to the final. So now Nepomniachtchi has to beat Wei in order to qualify to the candidates, take a second place in the Grand Prix. Otherwise, the second place in the Grand Prix, as well as the qualification spot, goes to Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So this time, the situation is very, very simple. And once again, the reminder of the entire field of the Grand Prix, if you can, just check for yourself. Not that many classical wins. One of them, it's Nepomniachtchi winning against MVL in the semi-finals, was a really, really big one. And the second one, the only two, and the second one was Navarra knocking out Dmitry Yakovenko in the second round. Wei, on his way to the final, defeated Anish Giri in the tiebreak, Karyakin on a tiebreak, and then David Navarra on a tiebreak. Yeah, so once again, apologies for those who joined the show expecting more chess, but that's not our fault. That's the players. So they've battled it out very, very quickly today. And once again, rewatching, slowly turning the engine off and trying to learn the patterns, this game 2 of the tiebreak is really, really recommended. I think a model game on how you play in such situations after the exchange sacrifice, especially on e6. And that'll be it for today. Once again, before I sign off, I want to thank all those who supported the Grand Prix cycle and World Chess this year, so those companies who made the event possible. For Sagro, the strategic partner of World Chess and entire Grand Prix series, Algorand, the blockchain partner, Kaspersky, cybersecurity partner, and Ustek, the partner of the event in Jerusalem. Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in day after tomorrow. There'll be the first classical game of the final we'll be talking about. 5 minutes to 3, the show's going to start. I'm talking Jerusalem time, and therefore adjust to your time zone accordingly.